Hello and welcome to today's English lesson. My name is Stuart, and in today's lesson we're looking at how we use the modal auxiliary verb ought in English. Let's go to the intro. Now, as I said before, today's lesson is looking at ought and how we use it in English. And ought is a modal auxiliary verb similar to should. Okay? Now, the difference between should and ought is very, very small. In fact, sometimes you can use them both exactly the same to have exactly the same meaning. The main difference between ought is that we use it normally with to, ought to. Not all the time, but normally you'll see the structure ought to, whereas the rest of the modal auxiliary verbs like must, might, should, can, could, etc. Don't take the to infinitive structure, but ought to or ought does take the to plus infinitive structure. Okay? Now, we're going to have a look at some examples here. We're going to see how we use it in positive sentences, questions, and negative sentences. And we'll see if we can get a little bit of a clearer idea of how we use ought after seeing these four examples. Now, the first example is you ought to see a doctor. You ought to see a doctor. It's my advice, or I think it would be a good idea for you, considering that you're not looking too well, it would be a good idea, or you should, or you ought to see a doctor. Okay, so you ought to see a doctor. Now, the second example is using ought to in a question structure. Do you think I ought to see a doctor? Do you think I ought to see a doctor? Now, technically, we can use ought to in this sense without do in a question. We can say, ought I to see a doctor? Ought I to see a doctor as a question? But it's very formal. So the way that we get around the formal structure is by putting something here like do you think, or do you think it's a good idea? Do you think I ought to see a doctor? Okay? Rather than say ought I to see a doctor, which is this example here. So this is the more formal idea. So this is the less formal question with do you think, and the more formal question with ought I to see a doctor with no do. Now, this next one, smoking ought to be banned. Oughtn't it? So we're using here a question tag with oughtn't, and you'll notice that there's no to. So this is an example when we use ought with no to. So if you hear that ought always has to be used with to, it's not the case. We can, in question tags and other examples, not use to with ought. And this example here, he ought not to have been so mean to me. He ought not to have been so mean to me in a negative structure, okay? He ought not to have been so mean to me. He shouldn't have been so mean to me, but he was, okay? Now, this is a different structure to the rest. I'll explain that also in a minute when we have a look at the when we use ought to, the reasons why we use ought to. Now, the main reason that we use ought to is for duty or obligation, advice, recommendation. Let's look at the let's look at the examples. You ought to slow down. It's a school area. So you're with your friend in a car. He's driving too fast. You see a sign saying 30 kilometers an hour. Your friend is going 60 kilometers an hour. You say to him, you ought to slow down. You ought to slow down. You should slow down. It's a good idea for you to slow down because it's a school area. Second example, we ought to be going. It's getting late. We ought to be going. It's getting late, okay? It's a good idea that we get going because otherwise we'll be late for our next event or our next appointment. The last one here, you ought to have sold your house last year. You ought to have sold your house last year, but you didn't sell it. But you ought to have sold it, okay, because the prices were higher. The prices have dropped in the last year, so my advice would have been for you to sell your house last year. So you ought to have sold your house last year. Now you can't sell your house, okay? Now, two things here. Normally we're using ought to with the infinitive structure straight afterwards, meaning now. We can also use it with the be continuous structure, and we can also use it with the have past participle structure when we're talking about the past, which is the example that we have here. Okay? So you ought to have sold your house last year, past event. You ought to have sold. If I say you ought to sell your house, it means now. Okay? And the last one is for deduction, when we deduce something. So, they ought to be here soon. They left ages ago. Now, I know that they left 2 hours ago. They're supposed to be coming here, so they ought to be here soon. I'm deducing that fact because it's common sense. They should be here soon, or they ought to be here soon. And this last one, I've ordered 3 pizzas. That ought to be enough, okay? Because there's only 3 or 4 people, so 3 pizzas ought to be enough, okay? I'm deducing that that is the correct amount for us to eat well, okay? 3 pizzas, 3 of us, 3 pizzas ought to be enough. Now, thank you very much for watching. If you have any comments, please leave them below. Remember also to share the video on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Google+. Share the video if you liked it. Have a good day, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Bye.